William L. Wipfler was ordained an Episcopal priest in 1955, and in that same year he married Pauline Papperman, a high school English teacher. They served as missionaries in the Dominican Republic from 1955 to 1963, and then in Costa Rica from 1964 to 1966. In 1967, Reverend Wipfler began his work at the National Council of Churches, Caribbean and Latin America Department, becoming director of that department in 1968. From 1977 to 1988, he served as director of the National Council of Churches Human Rights Office. In 1978, Reverend Wipfler received his Ph.D. from Union Theological Seminary, New York, New York.
When I was in my middle year in the seminary, I had an opportunity to go as an intern to Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker. And later, as a matter of fact, very few years ago, I went to do a workshop in the Dominican Republic in the north on planning for the future. And as a gift, I was presented with a marvelous set of drawings of Martin Luther King, of Mahatma Gandhi, and Catholic Worker Director Dorothy Day. It was a surprise, but very moving to me because having done a short internship at the Catholic Worker, she had become a very wonderful model of social change, effectiveness, and of caring for the people in the lower Manhattan that surrounded the Catholic Worker. And this was so symbolic of the feelings that I had about nonviolence and peaceful change. It was a wonderful gift from the Dominicans who attended that seminar.
Let me ask you, Bill, was that the beginning of your kind of sensitivity, the development of your sensitivity to the poor and the oppressed, people who were being mistreated by society? Or would you trace the beginning of your sensitivity to an earlier point in your life?
Yes, I would trace it to my parents, actually. When I was a boy, as a matter of fact, a child of the Depression, I became aware when I was about 5 years old that my mother constantly had had stew in a big pot on our coal stove in the kitchen, and that people would arrive who I didn't know and sit down to eat with us. And then I noticed that they would go out back and she would have 60 bricks that were moved from the garage by one man. He would then enjoy a big piece of brown bread and a bowl of stew. And then the next man who came would move them back to the garage. They would go back and forth from the entrance to the basement to the garage. And later, in my awareness as a pre-teenager, I raised questions about that and asked her about the bricks. And she said, "Bill, those are my dignity bricks. Work for food, and that's how these people could get through their search for work out on Long Island in the potato fields. Your dad saw a mark on our wall that said easy pickings and wanted to erase it, and she wouldn't allow it." My dad was a letter carrier for 44 years on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He was off down in the village where all of the refugee movements began, and he one time took me to work with him at 4 in the morning where he was going to deliver mail. And the thing that amazed me was that this man, who was a third grade dropout, spoke in the experience I had with him that day, spoke 9 different languages to the various people in the tenements of Lower Manhattan. He had learned their languages over those years, those decades, because he felt it was his way of expressing his concern for them.
Bill, you've told us a little bit about your home life, your parents, and their influence on you in terms of their sensitivity to the poor and the needy. Now I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your high school experience. And was there anything in particular in your high school experience that led you to become critical concerning public policy?
I actually went to a school that was science and technology oriented, Brooklyn Technical High School. We were introduced to new faculty that would be joining. At the introductory session of my 3rd year at high school, we were told that 2 of the former scientists at Los Alamos, who had helped create the atomic bombs, were going to join our faculty in the physics department. What surprised me as we went on through the following year was I took those courses because I was fascinated by the whole area of nuclear and atomic science. They were obviously very much opposed to atomic power, nuclear power, and any further development of nuclear weapons. The very people who had worked on those. I was really not provided with any classical education. It was science oriented. And therefore, when I reached my senior year, I saw myself as becoming a scientist, a physicist, and I took the exam for Cooper Union. I was hoping that they would lead in a very direct way to my being a physicist. And then one day in a physics class, I asked a question. I don't remember what the question was, but the professor turned to me and said, "Mr. Wipfler, if you're going to ask questions like that, why don't you go to seminary and study metaphysics instead of physics?" No idea what he meant. I had been an attender at church, but not deeply engaged, except because the young people were my friends. And so a lot of my attendance was related to the social nature of what was happening at that church. A fine priest and pastor, but I was not that enthused. I went for social reasons. And one day on my way to the college, the university, there was a newspaper sitting on the subway seat next to me. I never read the newspaper. I picked it up And I looked, and it was, of all things, turned to the obituary page. But then I looked at the bottom, and it was the announcements of all the church services in Manhattan that were being held that weekend and on the next Sunday. And one of them just popped off the page. It read that at St. Thomas's Fifth Avenue, the great church across from the Cathedral of St. Patrick, William Pollard, director of Oak Ridge Physics Laboratory, would be preaching. Now, in my mind, how is it possible that the head of a physics laboratory, the second most important after Los Alamos, was going to preach a sermon at a church? The challenge was so great that I went to St. Thomas's that afternoon or that evening and listened to his spirit-shaking sermon. I was stunned that a, a scientist could put physics and theology into a language that I could understand and that challenged my where I was. So arrogant Wipfler met him at the door, thanked him for his sermon, and said, I'm just wondering how you can be the director of the physics laboratory at Oak Ridge and preach a sermon like that. And he smiled. He said, I'm going to be at a meeting right now with some of the people of this parish, but can you be here at 8 in the morning and we'll have breakfast together? And I thought to myself, wow, I can go back to school at Cooper Union and say, I had breakfast with the director of Oak Ridge. We met the next morning, and he took me to a little restaurant around the corner that still used butcher paper, that stuff that they would pull off a big roll and put over a table. And I don't know how long he gave me. It had to have been an hour and a half. He talked to me, never downed me. He discussed with me. He wrote formulas and he wrote concepts on that paper that began to excite my mind, open up things in me that I had not thought about, challenge me in ways I hadn't thought about challenging myself ever, and helped me to see that science and religion were not at opposite ends of something, that they in many ways were related and could be related. And it began to push me to begin to rethink that question for which I was challenged. I am sorry to this day that I did not take with me that tablecloth of butcher paper to keep as a great memory of that meeting with Dr. Pollard.
In 1944, Dr. Pollard's reputation in physics took him to Columbia University for 2 years to work as a research scientist on the Manhattan Project. Pollard and his fellow researchers were told very little about the purpose of their work, and it was only after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that they realized the significance of their research. He once recalled for a reporter how disturbed he felt immediately after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, saying that his initial exuberance following the bomb drop on Hiroshima was replaced with a feeling close to terror. Dr. Pollard was the founder and first president of the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, founded in 1946. In 1966, ORINS became Oak Ridge Associated Universities. Dr. Pollard became an ordained Episcopal priest in 1954 and served as priest associate of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Oak Ridge until his death in 1989. As a priest and nuclear physicist, Pollard was able to resolve in his mind the somewhat complex relationship between science and religion. As he struggled with the issue, he came to believe, to put it simply, that science was a way of investigating the wonders of God's creations. In one of his sermons, Pollard cited the Genesis passage where God says to man and woman, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth." For Pollard, dominion over the earth included man's ability to control fire, metals, and finally nuclear energy, the focus area of his research. He did not even build a nuclear fallout shelter in his home during the 1960s, saying that should such an event occur, he would prefer to be ministering to those suffering rather than hiding in a shelter. So, Bill, after your meeting with Mr. Pollard, Dr. Pollard, what was the next step in your spiritual journey?
I began to look at everything that was happening at Cooper Union with an entirely different perspective. He had really convinced me to look behind and around the things that I considered to be physical and physics, to ask myself questions, not to find solutions, but to ask myself questions. What's the meaning of this? What's the source? What's finally the purpose? What is happening in the world and in physics and so on? And I did. And it became more and more clear that through my life, even going to Brooklyn Tech and then to Cooper Union, I was on a search for understanding of reality, of both the physical and spiritual. I never would put spiritual in there, but my questions obviously raised that because the professor was so distressed about what I had asked. And I finally, toward the end of my second semester at Cooper Union, decided to go to the priest at my parish and talk to him about what it all meant. And of all things, I made that decision about 10 o'clock at night. I couldn't go to sleep. And so I rushed over to his house. And at 10 o'clock, I knew he was a 9 o'clock sleeper. At 10 o'clock, banged on his door. And when he opened the door, he looked at me. I was clearly distraught and impatient. And he smiled and he said, "Well, you finally heard it." And I was in part offended. I didn't like people double guessing why I was going to talk to them. And he said, "You've been asking all the right questions for so long, but I didn't want to interfere in the decisions you might make." And he invited me in, and we talked till the early hours of the morning. And it was at that point that he said I needed to talk to our bishop and to find out whether Cooper Union was an appropriate place to continue, or whether I needed a wider and a deeper understanding of other disciplines like history and literature and philosophy and those things, and whether I should transfer to some other university.